This is beyond the business and what really matters.
We live inside the systems we almost never notice until they stop working. We charge our phones, we turn on the lights, we use the TV, we run electric appliances, and we don't really question any of it. Electricity is just part of everyday life. It's not something we actively notice, everything just works fine. At least that's what we believe. We don't really ask how it works, in the same way most of us don't ask how the internet works. We just know it should. And because it works, we don't stop to think about the system behind it until one day it doesn't. The light doesn't turn on, the screen stays black, the power is gone, and only then does the question appear. Why did this happen? What failed? What I used to think honestly was that moments like this were mostly about technology. A broken line, a failed component, a bad coincidence. I don't think that anymore. What we usually don't realize is that in most cases it's not a single failure, it's the system underneath, the infrastructure we rely on without thinking about it. The grids, the cables, the substations that were built a long time ago for a very different world. Much of this system was designed decades ago when demand was simpler, more predictable, and energy mostly flowed in one direction. It was never built for today's reality, like for electric cars or data centers, constant digital load, or a world that never really slows down. And yet, this same system is still carrying all of it. Not because it was rethought or redesigned, but because it was kept running, fixed, reinforced, pushed a bit further every time. Most of the time, that's enough, until it isn't. And this is the core idea of this episode, said as clearly as possible. The energy transition is not struggling because of energy, it's struggling because of infrastructure. When we talk about old infrastructure, it's important to be clear about what that actually means. This isn't some abstract idea or a distant technical problem. In many cities, the energy system people depend on every single day is older than most of the people using it. In New York, for example, parts of the electrical grid still rely on equipment installed back in the 1930s and 1940s. Some transformers and underground cables that have been working for more than 80 years. In London, large sections of the distribution network come from the post war period, built for the city that used far less electricity than it does today. Paris still runs on a grid whose core was shaped in the 1950s and 60s, adjusted over the time, but never fundamentally rebuilt. In Berlin, parts of the system still follow layouts designed before reunification based on industrial needs that simply don't exist anymore. Even places that feel modern, like Los Angeles, are running on grid components with an average age of over 40 years, and some substations have been operating far longer than they were ever designed to. This pattern repeats across Europe and North America, where transmission and distribution systems are often 30, 40, sometimes 50 years old. These networks were created for the world with fewer devices, smoother demand, and far less pressure. Back then, energy mostly flowed one way, from power plant to consumer, without constant peaks or reversals. Today, the same system carries electrical vehicles charging overnight, data centers running nonstop, and energy flows that change depending on the time of day or the weather. We keep it going by replacing parts, strengthening weak points, and adding layers on top of what already exists. As long as the lights stay on, the system stays out of sight. The problem is that age in infrastructure doesn't show up as a single dramatic failure. It shows up slowly, as tension, as limits, as a system that still works, but still increasingly tight. A common question that comes up at this point is why we can't just update the systems quickly. Energy infrastructure isn't software. You can't roll out a new version overnight. It's a massive physical layer built into cities, streets, buildings, and entire regions. Replacing it means enormous capital costs, long construction timelines, constant disruptions, and political risk that a few decision makers are willing to take on. So instead of full replacement, what usually happens is extension. Systems get upgraded piece by piece. Weak points are reinforced, new components are added around old ones. Over time, another problem appears. A lot of this equipment is already obsolete. Some components are no longer manufactured, spare parts become harder to find, technical documentation is outdated or incomplete. In some cases, the engineers who originally designed the system are no longer around, and newer teams are forced to work around decisions made decades ago. And at some point, improving the system quietly turns into keeping it just alive. This became visible earlier in Chile in February 2025. A major failure in the transmission system led to a large scale blackout that affected central parts of the country. Around 200,000 homes and businesses lost electricity, including industrial sites and critical services. Power wasn't restored instantly. In some areas, outages lasted several hours, stretching well into the day. Hospitals switched to diesel generators, transport systems were disrupted, and industrial operations had to stop. What stood out here was not just the number of customers affected, but the time it took to recover. Crews weren't dealing with a simple fix. They were trying to stabilize a system that has lost balance. Officially, these events are often described as technical incidents or temporary disruptions, which is a very calm way of saying that a large part of the country stopped working for most of the day. Just 2 months later, on April 28, 2025, a much larger version of the same pattern played out in Spain and Portugal. This time, the scale was national. Large parts of both countries lost power at the same time, affecting millions of people across the Iberian Peninsula. Electricity was out for hours. In some regions, power returned after 4 6 hours, while in other outages lasted longer, approaching 8 hours or more. Banks stopped working, card payments failed, ATMs went offline, airports were disrupted for most of the day. In Portugal, Lisbon airport was affected, the aircraft circling because normal systems were not fully available. Hospitals moved onto backup generators and stayed there for hours. Backup systems are designed to buy time, but not to replace the country. And when recovery takes half a day, it's no longer a hiccup. It's a system struggling to regain control. On the generation side, the scale of change is hard to miss. Around 2020, global investment in grids and power system was roughly 300 billion a year. By the middle of this decade, that number is moving toward 500 billion, with projections reaching around 570 billion by 2027. Solar and wind alone now attract close to 500 billion annually compared to about 300 billion only a few years ago. Capacity keeps expanding at record speed. On the paper, this looks like success, and in many ways it is. But alongside this growth, curtailment has risen sharply. Around 90 terawatt hour of renewable electricity are now produced globally each year and not used compared to roughly 30 just a few years ago. We build record amounts of clean energy, celebrate the numbers, publish the charts, and then quietly switch part of it off because the system can't handle it. It's a bit like buying a faster car and realizing your garage door still opens manually. Across regions, the same signal keeps appearing. In Germany, between 5 to 8 terawatt hour of renewable electricity are curtailed every year. In China, curtailment reaches tens of terawatt hour annually, with some provinces losing 10 to 15% of their generation at certain points. In California, solar curtailment grown from around 1 to 2 terawatt hour to 5, 7 in just a few years. So the energy exists, the demand exists. What missing is infrastructure that can handle new volumes, new directions, and new timing. When blackouts and curtailment are placed next to each other, they stop looking like separate problems. They become two sides of the same system failure. In one case, there is too much energy and nowhere to put it. In the other, energy disappears and the system can't stay stable. In both cases, the issue isn't generation or demand. It sits in between. We keep plugging more and more into the same old socket. And every time it sparks, we act surprised, as if the socket promised it could handle a 21st century lifestyle. Before we finish, there is one simple thing I want to say. This story isn't really about cables or grids. It's about trust. About the fact that every day we just assume things will work. We flip a switch and the lights comes on. We don't think about it. We don't plan for it. We just trust the system. Infrastructure is what makes that possible. It's what lets life feel normal and stable. And when it starts falling behind, that trust doesn't break all at once. It slowly slips. Things stop working as smoothly. Small interruptions appear. Nothing dramatic, just enough to notice that something isn't quite right anymore. And that's usually how problems shows up. Not suddenly, but quietly. This was Beyond the Business. Thank you for listening.